So question 1 asks us to find which of these statements is correct with respect to capitalism. So we get told that capitalism is an economic system in which private property markets and firms play an important role. Given this definition, which one of the following statements is correct? So I'm going to go through each statement. And the way that I like to approach MCQs is I treat each statement as its own true and false. So I try to establish, okay, is A a correct or incorrect statement, and then go to B and C and D. So we'll look at A, and then I'm going to ask you whether or not you think A is a correct or incorrect statement. So A says, an economic system is a way of organizing the production and distribution of goods and services in an entire economy. So do we think that this answer or this statement is a correct statement or an incorrect statement? So please don't worry about getting wrong answers. This is a learning exercise. Great. So I have a true and someone says A is correct. I have some thumbs ups. Perfect. Okay, so A is a correct statement. So this is the economic system that we focus on in core, because it is the economic system that tends to be mainstreamed within within most economies globally. So even a country like China would be regarded as capitalist when it comes to the organizing production and distribution. Maybe somebody in the chat wants to explain why we would regard China as a capitalist economy. Production happens in firms. Yes, 100%. Okay. So firms are one of the fundamental institutions of a capitalist economy. What are the other institutions that would tell us that China is a capitalist economy? So yes, we have the presence of firms in China. Ms. Brewer says markets and private property. Perfect. Okay, so China would be regarded as having a capitalist economic system because there is the presence of all three of these institutions. Okay, now the reason why we might think of China as a different capitalist system to a country like the USA is because of the way that the other institutions that we see in economies play a role. And that we're going to look at in question 2. Okay, so if any economy has these three institutions, then there must be some capitalist way to how production and distribution is organized. So A is correct, but then we just check that B is incorrect, C is incorrect, and D is incorrect. So B says, the knowledge you attain from the Economics 114 module is considered private property. So this is incorrect. So I'm giving you the answer, but I want to know if anyone can tell me why. Why is B an incorrect statement? And I'm going to give you a little bit of a hint. You need to think about Unit 12. Something covered in Unit 12 tells us why Economics 114, the content that you are taught in this module, cannot be considered private property. So I'm throwing quite a tricky question out there. How do we define? Okay, so actually Mr. Selleck says, because knowledge cannot be private property. If I'm using that knowledge, you can use it as well. Perfect. Okay. So what does it mean? What economic term would we put to that? If I'm using it, you can use it as well. What do we call that? When a good can be used both by you and by me at the same time. We say that that type of good is non-rivalrous. Anything that is private is rivalrous and excludable. So knowledge is not rivalrous. It means that if I consume the knowledge that is presented in this course, it doesn't now mean that there's less knowledge available for you to consume. Awesome, Mr. Selick. Okay, so private property establishes goods as both rival and excludable. So this is not correct. Okay, so I'm sneaking a little bit of Unit 12 theory in here because I think it's just good to see where that answer comes from. C then says there is no role for governments in modern capitalist systems. I know that it is obviously incorrect because we've already established that A is correct, but it's good to think, why is this incorrect? So yes, there are definitely roles for governments in modern capitalist systems. Awesome. They need to rule the markets via laws and regulations. Perfect. So we need governments in order to regulate markets, because why would we need governments to regulate markets, even competitive markets? What did we show in units 8 and 12? We showed that markets, even very perfectly competitive markets, can lead to what? They can lead to market failure. Okay, so even economies that abide by free market principles may need a role for governments, because things like externalities can lead to inefficient over or underproduction. So there will always be a role for governments in modern capitalist systems. Okay, and then D says firms in capitalist systems are usually managed by the workers. That is incorrect. So firms in capitalist systems are managed by managers who are usually put into that position by owners, so the residual claimants to the profits that private firms make. And those managers would then give the commands to the workers that would then lead to production in those firms. Okay, so this is question 1. It tackles a lot of different concepts around capitalism, and I've also tried to use it to remind you about some of the theory that will also be used later in later units. So let's move to question 2. Question 2 should be super straightforward after doing question 1. So question 2 says, which of the following economic institutions are of central importance in capitalism as an economic system? So this is a past paper question that just said which institutions are important. I've changed it to be less ambiguous. So I've made it which institutions are centrally important. And the reason I've done that is so that you think about these over here. And that's exactly what Ms. Peterson has said. So if we look at the 4 answers, A says markets and governments. Yes, government can be important in a capitalist system, but it is not one of the central institutions that defines a capitalist economic system. Markets are a central institution. So A is incorrect. B, again, this is a central institution of a capitalist system, but governments aren't. And so B is incorrect. C is incorrect. Families are important in economic systems, but are not central institutions to a capitalist system. Private property and markets, yes, are of central importance. And then, as we already established, the third one is firms. Okay. Everyone happy with question 1 and 2? We'll move on to question 3, which also covers a little bit of capitalist theory as well. Trying to make sure I cover all the bases here. So question 3 tells us, which of the following statements is or are correct? So we have 4 statements here. We need to establish which of these are correct. And depending on which ones we think are correct, that's going to determine which of A, B, C, or D is the answer to this question. So statement 1 says, technological advancement and the division of labor have both played an important role in increasing the scale of productions of firms in a market economic system. So by a market economic system, we're talking about a capitalist system. So an economic system that is centered around markets and firms and private property. So is statement 1 a correct statement or an incorrect statement? So have technological advancement and the division of labor helped to increase the scale of production? That is correct. Yes, I agree with all of you. Statement 2 then says, firms competing with one another provide an incentive to refrain from adopting and developing new and more productive technologies. So is statement 2 correct or incorrect? So Lorato says it's incorrect. Simon, yes. Okay, now I'm going to challenge you a little bit. What word in this statement makes it incorrect? So pick out one word in that statement that makes this incorrect. Awesome. Refrain. Excellent. Okay, so firms competing with one another provide an incentive to engage in this race to try and innovate and to find new productive technologies. Great. Okay, now I'm going to ask you another question, which is going to come up in some of the theory I'm going to cover a bit later. What incentivizes firms to adopt and develop new and more productive technologies? What do we call the thing that gives you an incentive to want to look for new and more productive technologies? I'm looking for a very particular economic concept. Okay, so they are competitive, yes. So Miss Malala, awesome. Innovation rents. Wonderful. Okay, so if you are able to be the first to develop new and more productive technologies, it means that through that innovation, you are able to make additional economic rent. Love it. Okay, so we're going to come to innovation rent a bit later. So this is incorrect. Statement 3 says it is impossible for markets to exist outside a capitalist system. Is this correct or incorrect? It is impossible for markets to exist outside a capitalist system. That is incorrect. It is absolutely possible for markets to exist outside capitalist systems. You can have markets in communist economic systems. You can have markets in socialist economic systems. In older bartering systems, they were markets. So this is definitely incorrect. 4 says some of the ideas about capitalism can be attributed to Adam Smith. So can we attribute some of the ideas about capitalism to Adam Smith? Yes, we can. So 1 and 4 correct, which means A is incorrect. 2 and 3 are definitely incorrect, which makes B incorrect. 1 and 4 correct, so C is correct. And we said 3 is not correct, so D is incorrect. So the answer to question 3 is C. Okay. Lorato, what are all the types of rent in economics? Okay, so all rent is economic rent. The name we give to the type of rent just depends on the particular problem we're trying to solve. So when we look at the rent or the economic rent that is earned when you develop new technologies, we call that particular type of innovation of economic rent innovation rent. When we are looking at the rent that you earn in a job, we call it employment rent. When we look at the economic rent that is earned by consumers, we call it consumer surplus. When we look at the economic rent that producers make, we call it producer surplus. These are all types of economic rent. So they all rely on the same basic formula. And the basic formula of economic rent, so economic rent is the value of a chosen action or decision less the value of the next best alternative, which We also call the reservation option, which we also can think of as the status quo, the thing that is almost guaranteed to happen unless we change our decision, we take a different course of action. So, for example, if you develop a new technology that is cost saving, it means that the profit that you can make by adopting that new technology could be different from the profit that you would have made had you stuck to your existing technology. And the difference in those profits would be the innovation rate. Okay. Ms. Grube says, is high employment rate good or bad for the employee that has the job? Okay, so what it would tell us is that if a worker has a high employment rent, it means that the value of the job they have far exceeds the value of the next best alternative. And typically we would say that the alternative is no job. So if you are deriving a high employment rent, it means that the value you are getting from working far exceeds what you would receive were you not working. Now, whether this is good or bad depends on whether or not this gives your employer some power over you. So if you are earning a high employment rent, that generally would give your employer a lot of power, because what it means then is that you stand to lose a lot if you lose this job. And so in that case, you would work really hard. You would put in more efforts because you would not want to lose that high employment rent. So it can put more power in the hands of your employer, because they would then know that you have to work hard because you risk losing quite a lot. Does that make sense, Ms. Mube? Great. Okay, so it measures what you stand to lose. Okay, so let's move then on to theory about comparative and absolute advantage. So we have two individuals, Zuri and Nala. I just noticed that there was no question 4, but that might have just, oh, here it is, got stuck behind. Okay, so let's first do this. So question 4 says, the kitchen manager at an Italian restaurant is deciding what tasks to assign to his 2 cooks, John and David. John can make 25 pizzas or 40 servings of pasta per hour, and David can make 20 pizzas or 30 servings of pasta. Which of the following should be the manager's choice? So I'm just going to write that down. So we have John and David. And what we now know is that for each hour, in other words, if we dedicated John purely to making pizzas, then he would make 25 pizzas in an hour. If we dedicated David's attention and resources to purely making pizzas, he would make 20. If we dedicated John to only making pasta, he would make 40 servings. And if we purely dedicated David's time and effort to making pasta, he would make 30 servings. So looking at this information here, who has an absolute advantage in pizza? Who is absolutely better at producing pizza? John. Okay, so how do we see that it's John? So if John puts all of those resources of an hour into pizzas, he'd make 25, but David would only make 20. So John is absolutely better at producing pizza in an hour. Who has an absolute advantage in pasta? Also John. Okay, so John is the GOAT. John can do everything better than David can. Why would we not make John do both pizza and pasta then? If he's better at doing both of these things, why would we not make him do both pizza and pasta. What would happen if John had to divide his time between pizza and pasta? So Mr. Mtembi says we should assign people according to their comparative advantage. Yes, absolutely. But why? What would it mean if John spent half an hour in pizza and half an hour in pasta? What would happen? He would be overworked and be less efficient, okay? So if we made John split his attention between these two things, we no longer would get 25 pizzas and 40 servings of pasta. We would get some amounts of pizza and some amounts of pasta, but we would no longer be able to get these larger amounts. So comparative advantage means that we can put people's attention onto that activity which they have a comparative advantage in, and then we would be able to get a greater amount of both goods. We wouldn't have to necessarily sacrifice some amounts of pizza and some amounts of pasta if the person who was better at both of these things had to then do both of them. We have to find a way to specialize. So comparative advantage has to do with specialization. It's where we're using division of labor so that people are put into that activity to which they are better suited. Not best suited, better suited. Okay, so how would we find the comparative advantage? What we need to know in order to calculate comparative advantage is we need to know how much each pizza costs in terms of pasta. In other words, if John spends an hour producing pizza, how much pasta is he sacrificing? And so we can then determine how many pizzas is equivalent to how many pastas. So what we would say is that 25 pizzas is equivalent to 40 pastas. Okay, so John could make 25 pizzas or 40 servings of pasta. So how much pasta would one pizza be worth? So Ms. Malala, you've given another equation. So I'm going to show you how these two things get to the same answer. So if 25 is to 40, what is 1 to? So if 25 pizzas equals 40 pastas, how much does one pizza equal to? So I divide both of these sides by 25. 1.6, perfect. Okay, so one pizza costs, in quotes, 1.6 servings of pasta. That is the opportunity cost. Okay, so when John produces one pizza, he is giving up the opportunity to produce 1.6 servings of pasta. So Ms. Malala said that the comparative advantage we can also find by taking what you lose over what you gain. So when you produce 25 pizzas, you gain 25 pizzas. And when you produce 25 pizzas, you're losing 40 pastas. So 40 divided by 25 gives me 1.6. So those two ways of approaching the problem are equivalent. Okay, so one pizza is equal to 1.6 pastas for John. For David, 20 pizzas is equivalent to 30 pastas. So how much is one pizza worth? So instead of producing one pizza, David could have produced 1.5 servings of pasta. Awesome. Okay, so now we have these two values. One pizza is equivalent to 1.6 pasta. One pizza is equivalent to 1.5 pasta. Who is comparatively better at producing pizza? Is it John or David? So Ms. Malala says it's David. Mr. Melinda also says it's David. Ms. Peterson says it's David. Yes. So David has the comparative advantage in pizza. And the reason why is because it only costs him 1.5 servings of pasta per pizza. The cost to John is higher. It's 1.6. So David has a comparative advantage in pizza. Automatically, we now know who has the comparative advantage in pasta. It's going to be John. So because David is comparatively better at producing pizza, it must then mean that John is comparatively better at producing pasta. Okay. Does this make sense? So using this information, we're now going to go to the answers. Okay, so statement A says, the managers should fire David because he is not as productive as John. John will do both jobs. How do we feel about this option? This is wrong, right? We already said that it doesn't help for John to do both things because John will no longer be able to get this much pizza and pasta unless he somehow finds a way to clone himself, which is impossible. Okay, so A is wrong. B says John will make pizza because he has a comparative advantage in making pizza. Is B correct or incorrect? John will make pizza because he has a comparative advantage in pizza. This is incorrect. We've already established that John is comparatively better at making pasta. C says David will make pizza because he has a comparative advantage in making pizza. So C is true. Okay, and then we just double check that D is incorrect. So D says John and David both will spend half their time making pizza and half their time making pasta because both have a comparative advantage in making pizza. D is very, very incorrect. Okay, it is not true that both have a comparative advantage. Okay, even though John is absolutely better at both tasks, comparatively speaking, David is better at producing pizza. Okay, great. So that's the basics of comparative and absolute advantage. So let's go to another question to check our understanding. Ms. Brewer asks, so if we know that if John is better in one item, then what's left will be the job of the other person? Okay, so I know exactly what you're trying to say, Ms. Brewer. I'm just going to add one word to your statement. If we know that if John is comparatively better or relatively better, then what's left will be the job of the other person. Yes. So it's always about the comparative difference. So who is relatively, comparatively better? Okay, because as we saw, John is better at doing both things. So it's about the comparative advantage. Does that make sense how I just adjusted your statements a little bit? Great. Okay, so this is kind of important because when you write down an answer in a test, it's always good to be as clear as possible so that the marker knows exactly what you mean. But I know exactly what you meant. I'm just adding a little bit of nuance so that it's absolutely correct. Okay, Zuri and Nala spend their time producing tomato sauce and mustard. The following table indicates the maximum amount of each product that can be produced if they spend an hour on producing only that good. So we have exactly the same problem here as we did with John and David. So we have Zuri can either produce 6 bottles of tomato sauce in an hour or 3 bottles of mustard. Or Nala can produce 12 bottles of tomato sauce in an hour or 4 bottles of mustard. Okay, which person has the comparative advantage in the production of tomato sauce? So what we need to find out is how much mustard would be given up per tomato sauce produced. So I think of these as ratios. So 6 tomato sauce for Zuri is the equivalent of 3 bottles of mustard. In other words, 1 tomato sauce is half a bottle of mustard. For Nala, 12 tomato sauce is equivalent to 4 mustard, and so 1 tomato sauce is going to be a third mustard. And so, as everybody in the chat has indicated, Nala is the one with the comparative advantage because a third is smaller than a half. So the cost to Nala of producing a bottle of tomato sauce is less than it is for Zuri. Great. One more question on comparative and absolute advantage, just to make sure that you are definitely getting all the marks here. The printer came out a little bit funny, so I'm just going to make sure that we can see this correctly. So this is 1.42. So we have Eswatini and South Africa both producing sugar and beef. If Eswatini devoted all its resources to producing sugar, it could produce 1 million tons per year, while if it devoted all its resources to producing beef, it could produce 7,000 tons per year. So I always make a little table because it just helps with finding the answer. So we have sugar and beef. So it would be 1 million tons of sugar and 7,000 tons of beef. South Africa, on the other hand, could produce 12 million tons of sugar per year or 220,000 tons of beef per year. The opportunity cost of a ton of beef in the country that has a comparative advantage in the production of beef is. Okay, so now we need to figure out for Eswatini, 1 million tons of sugar is equivalent to 7,000 tons of beef in terms of how resources could be used. For South Africa, it's 12 million and 220,000. So we want to know the opportunity cost of a ton of beef. In other words, we want this side to be 1. We want to know what does 1 ton of beef mean in terms of sugar. So if 7,000 beef is 1 million sugar, then 1 beef will be how much sugar for Eswatini? Just going to open up my calculator on my side. So it's going to be 1 million divided by 7,000. I get 142.86. So I get 142.86. Everyone agree with my answer there? So 1 ton of beef costs Eswatini 142.86 tons of sugar. For South Africa, it's going to be 54.55. So it looks like they've rounded up to 1 decimal place. So if we look at this here, who has the comparative advantage in beef? So for Eswatini, 1 beef is equivalent to 143. For South Africa, 1 beef costs 54.5 or 6. So South Africa has a lower cost of beef production, and it looks like the answer then is D. Okay, so Mr. Mtambi asked, how do you know which side to equate to 1? Okay, so the question is asking us, what is the opportunity cost of a ton of beef? So what we want to know is, if I produced 1 ton of beef, how much sugar would I give up? So the way I've written this is this much sugar to this much beef as a ratio. And I want to know, what does a ton of beef cost? So this being beef, I want to become 1. So I want both sides to be divided by 7,000. If I also use the equation that somebody mentioned earlier, I can say that the opportunity cost of a ton of beef is going to be equal to the sugar I lose, which is 1,000,000 tons, divided by the beef I gain, which is 7,000 tons. So you can either look at this opportunity cost problem in terms of ratio or this fraction, which is just a ratio, right? So a ton of beef for Eswatini costs 142.86. For South Africa, the opportunity cost of a ton of beef is going to be 12 million. So what they lose, the beef they lose divided by the sugar they, the sugar they lose divided by the beef they gain, which is 220,000. And that's where we get the 54.5. Okay. So the question tells us which needs to be equated to the one. Does that answer your question, Mr. Matembi? Great. Okay, now if you look at these answers here, if you got these equations the wrong way around, you'd probably end up with one of these answers. Okay, so these are distractors because those would be the answers that you would get if you applied the formula wrong. So always remember that if we want to know the comparative advantage of one good, we look at it in terms of the other good that could be produced. Okay, is everyone happy with comparative and absolute advantage? I tried to choose 3 questions that would cover everything, and then we can move on to the isocost. Great. Okay, so I've chosen quite a few questions to look at the isocost curve and the technology problems. And the reason why is because these types of questions always come up. So it's always good to understand everything that could be asked around this theory. So the first question I've chosen appears very simple. But what I want to do is use this, and I think this was in a tutorial and it stumped many people. What I want to do is use this question to establish where an isocost curve comes from. So we get told that a firm uses labor and coal to produce a pair of shoes. Coal costs 12 Rand 50 per ton and labor costs 5 Rand per worker. On the firm's 300 Rand isocost line, the firm will give up 0.8 tons of coal to hire 2 additional workers. Okay. So what do we mean by an isocost line? So if I had to draw this problem, what I would say is that, and it doesn't really matter which inputs you put on the X and Y axis, but I'm just going to put K and L. So this is capital and this is labor. We then want to find the isocost line representing a total cost of 300 Rand. So what we're saying with this statement here is that 300 Rand will be the price of capital times some quantity of capital, which I could actually just write as K, plus the price of labor times some quantity of labor. Now, we actually know what the price of capital and the price of labor are. So I can say 300 Rand is going to be 12.5K plus 5L. So if I had to put this equation into words, what I would say is that a total cost of 300 Rand would arise through different combinations of capital and labor, given these prices of capital and labor. So there are many different combinations of capital and labor that would get us to that total cost of 300 Rand. This is very similar to a budget line, okay? It's the same sort of idea. So we have 300 equals 12.5K plus 5L. But if I look at the picture here, I would plot this isocost line with K as the dependent variable, so to speak. So K is going to be all on its own on the left-hand side of the equation. So I want some line equation. So I want some equation that is y is equal to C plus mx. So I want some equation that fits y, which in this case is K, some intercept, a slope, and then my x variable, which in this case is L. So if I look at this equation here, what I want to do is rearrange so that K is all on its own on the left-hand side. So I'm going to start rearranging to get to that place. So I'm going to say 12.5K is equal to 300 minus 5L. So what I've done is I've rearranged this. Now, if I took this 12.5K to this side, it would become minus 12.5K. And if I took that 300 to this side, it would become minus 300. So I've just kind of skipped a step and just multiplied everything by minus. Okay, so that's how I've ended up with 12.5K equals 300 minus 5L. What would I then do next to get K all on its own? I would divide through by 12.5. So what I'm going to have is K is equal to 300 divided by 12.5, which gives me 24 minus, and 5 divided by 12.5 is 0.4 L. So this is the equation of a 300 Rand isocost line. So if I took this equation and plotted it in this picture, so this is the origin 0, 0, it means the y-intercept is going to be 24, and the slope is going to be minus 0.4, so the line is going to be negative. And then I could work out that intercept there by saying, well, if K is equal to 0, what would L need to be for this to give me a 0 answer? So I would have 24 is equal to 0.4 L. So 24 divided by 0.4 would be 60. So this would be 60. So there's my 300 Rand isocost line. Every single point on this line represents a combination of capital and labor that gives me a total cost of 300 Rand. So now we have this information. Okay, yes, Nikki, you're asking exactly the right answer. What does the slope of the isocost line represent? That is actually what's going to help us answer this. So if we look at this equation here, 24 represents the amount of capital that would be used to achieve a total cost of 300 when no labor is used. Okay, so think about what the intercept means. The intercept is the amount of capital when L is 0. So when L is 0, 24 units of capital would give me a total cost of 300. And I can confirm that by saying 24 times 12 Rand 50 gives me 300 Rand. Okay, so this intercept tells me the maximum capital that could be used to achieve a cost of 300 Rand. In other words, how many units of capital could 300 Rand afford me? The 60 here is defined in the same way. Each unit of labor costs 5 Rand. So if I'm spending 300 Rand on production, then 300 Rand divided by 5 Rand gives me 60. So this represents the maximum capital, the maximum labor that would cost me 300 Rand. Okay, so what does the slope represent? 0.4. I'm going to write this out in more general terms. So I'm going to say total cost is equal to the price of capital times the amount of capital plus the price of labor times the amount of labor. And I'm going to do the same thing here, but I'm not going to use these numbers. So I'm going to say the price of capital times capital equals total cost minus the price of labor times the amount of labor. How would I get capital on its own? I would divide everything through by the price of capital. So capital is equal to total cost over the price of capital minus the price of labor over the price of capital times labor. So the slope represents the price of labor divided by the price of capital. What do we call one price divided by another price? What do we call that concept when we take one price and divide it by some other price? We call it relative price. Awesome, Mr. Wisa. Okay, so we call it the relative price. In other words, the slope of this isocost line is the relative price of labor, because it is the price of L divided by the price of K. So the relative price of labor is going to be the price of labor, which is 5, divided by the price of capital, which is 12.5, and that gives me 0.4. That tells me that every single time I purchase a unit of labor, in other words, every single time I choose as a producer to use one more unit of labor, I give up 0.4 units of capital. Okay, so using 1 unit of labor has an opportunity cost of 0.4 units of capital. Hiring one more person means giving up 0.4 units of capital. So if we go back to the statement, it says the firm will give up 0.8 tons of coal. Okay, so I've used capital. This should have been coal. So let's just imagine I was talking about coal this whole time. So the firm will give up 0.8 tons of coal to hire 2 additional workers. Is this true or false, given what we just said? We said that 1 unit of labor means giving up 0.4 tons of coal. So using 2 additional people means giving up 0.8 tons of coal. And so this answer is true. Okay. So what we know from this isocost line is that 1 unit of labor comes at the cost of 0.4 units of coal. And that means that 2 units of labor will be 0.8 coal. Okay, so the answer to this question is true. And I've done a lot of theory, which isn't wholly necessary to answer this, but it just helps to go through this theory so that you understand where this concept of relative price comes from. Okay. Does anyone have any questions about this particular question? I don't see any questions, but someone might be typing. So if you have any questions, please put it down in the chat. Okay, I don't see any questions, so I'm going to move on to question 7. Okay, so question 7, we're going to continue with this theory, but now we're going to bring in the concept of technological domination and innovation rents. So question 7 tells us that a farmer produces 10 crates of apples using 2 inputs, labor and fertilizer. The wage rate is 80 Rand per hour and the price of fertilizer is 200 Rand per bag. The farmer has access to 3 technologies. In other words, each of these technologies produces 10 crates of apples. So the farmer has 3 different ways to produce the same output. Okay? The decision that this farmer is then having to make is which of these technologies is going to be the cheapest. Because the cheaper the technology is, the more profits the farmer will make. And the reason why I can say that is because if each of these technologies produce the same output, it means that given some price that the farmer can charge for their apples, every single one of these technologies is going to generate the same total revenue, because every single technology produces the same output, which is going to be sold for the same price. So the total revenue made using technology A is the same as the total revenue from technology B is the same total revenue from technology C. Profits is total revenue minus total cost. And so if the total revenue is the same, no matter which technology I use, I am going to make the most profits with the cheapest technology. Whichever technology makes this total cost smaller is going to make the profits bigger. Now, the reason why we start with domination is because if a technology is dominated, it will always cost more. Okay, so let's think through what technology domination means. So a technology is dominated by another technology. So a technology is dominated by another technology if it uses more of one input, but no less of the other inputs to make the same output. Okay, so if we compare 2 technologies, if those 2 technologies use the same amount of fertilizer, but the one technology uses more labor than the other, and they're producing the same output, then the technology that uses more labor must cost more, because you're using more labor with the same amount of fertilizer to get the same output. In other words, that extra labor is pretty useless. It's not adding anything to outputs. So if we look at these 3 technologies here, can anyone identify a dominated technology? And if you can identify a dominated technology, which technology dominates it? Okay, so Ms. Malala says she thinks technology C is dominated. Ms. Myberg, so a lot of people think that technology C is dominated. We have Mr. Jubelius says it is technology B. Nikki says B. Okay, so we have some disputes. Okay, Ms. Malala has changed her answer. Technology C dominates all 3. So I'm going to show you a picture, and then this will help us to see which one is dominated. So I can represent these technologies in an image. So I'm going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And you can draw this in a test very roughly. It's not an issue. And then 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Okay. So technology A uses 2 fertilizer and 5 labor. So technology A is over here. 2 fertilizer, 5 labor. Technology B uses 3 fertilizer and 6 labor. So technology B is over here. And then technology C uses 1 fertilizer, 7 labor. So here's technology C. Okay, so how do we find which technology is dominated? So Mr. Selleck, you've jumped many steps ahead, great, but I'm just going to go through this for everyone else to help explain where the answer comes from. So in order to find technologies that are dominated, I do the following. I take a vertical line up from the technology and a horizontal line from the technology, and I shade in the area that is contained by those two lines. What I notice now is that B falls in the shaded area. That tells me that B is dominated by A. Okay, right. The shaded area tells us that B is more costly. If I think about B relative to A, B is using 1 extra hour of labor and B is using an extra bag of fertilizer to make exactly the same output. Okay, so B, no matter what fertilizer costs and no matter what labor costs, B will always cost more than A. Always. Which means that as long as this farmer has A as an option, they would never choose B because B will forever be more expensive than A. So B is dominated by A. Ms. Malala asked, dominating is not the same as being cheap. No, dominating does not necessarily imply that it is cost effective. If something is dominated, definitely it costs more than something else. And so we would never consider it as an option. But if I look at C, I can see that a vertical line up from C and a horizontal line from C, that area contains no technologies. What that tells me is that C is not necessarily cheaper than B, nor is it necessarily cheaper than A. In order for me to figure out if C will be cheaper than these two is to know the actual cost of labor and fertilizer. So C doesn't dominate either A or B. So I cannot say for certain that C is necessarily cheaper. It's all going to depend on the prices of these two inputs. And the prices give me my isocost lines, right? So let's think about an isocost line that is very flat. The lower the isocost line, the cheaper it is to produce. So if the isocost line is very flat, C is going to be cheaper than A and B. But what if the isocost line is very steep? Now C will be more expensive than A. Okay, so something being dominated means it will never be chosen because it will always be more expensive than some other technology. But it doesn't mean that technologies that are not dominated are necessarily cheap. It depends on the price of labor and fertilizer. So the answer to A is B is dominated by A. That is only answering half the question. Why? Why is B dominated by A? The reason why B is dominated by A is because B uses more fertilizer and more labor than A to produce the same outputs. So steeper slope equals more expensive. Not necessarily. Steeper slope tells us something about the cost of labor relative to fertilizer. Okay, so we'll come to that in question B. So just keep that thought. Ms. Mtlube says, so if product is dominated, it doesn't mean the dominating product is more cost effective. So if technology B is dominated by A, most definitely A costs less than B. A will definitely be more cost effective than B. But does it mean that A will be more cost effective than C? No, that isn't guaranteed. Okay, so a technology that is dominated is definitely not cost effective. But a dominating technology may or may not be cost effective. It depends on the cost of labor and fertilizer. So let's just think about this intuitively. If I had to describe technology A versus technology C, which of technology A and C is more labor intensive? So which of these is more labor intensive? Technology A or technology C? Ms. Brewer says technology C. Perfect, great. So C is labor intensive. If labor is relatively cheap, will C or A be more cost effective? So if labor is relatively cheap, do you think A or C will be more cost effective? I love the question mark, Ms. Brewer. Yes. Okay. C will be more cost effective because this is making use of the input that is relatively cheaper. And so the production process, remember, technology is describing the production process, it's describing how inputs are combined to produce an output. And so if the production process makes use of an input that is relatively cheaper, it will make that technology cheaper. If labor had to become relatively expensive, what do you think will happen then? So if labor suddenly had to become more expensive, pushing it up in relative terms, we would probably then have to decide about moving our technology away from C to A. Because the more expensive labor becomes, it probably makes a more capital intensive technology cheaper. Okay, so the decision about which of these two technologies to use is going to depend on the prices of labor and fertilizer. So question B tells us that if fertilizer is plotted on the vertical axis, derive the equation of the isocost line for the farmer with the total cost of 36,000. So this is an exact replication of what we did with question 6. So what we want is we want an isocost line that is plotted with fertilizer on the left-hand side, and we want the total value to be 36,000. In other words, we want 36,000 to be equal to the price of fertilizer, which is 200 times the amount of fertilizer, plus the price of labor times the amount of labor. We now need to rearrange this so that F is on its own on the left-hand side. If you only wrote this in the test, you would get 1 mark because it's not complete. Technically speaking, this defines the isocost line with a total cost of 36,000. But if I plot this, I won't get the line exactly in this 2-dimensional framework. I need to have F on its own. So what I can then say is that 200F is going to be 36,000 minus ATL. And then I'm going to divide through by 200. So F is going to be 36,000 divided by 200 is it 18 or 180? I think I closed my calculator. So 36,000 divided by 200 is 180. Minus, and then 80 divided by 200 is going to be 0.4. So there is my isocost line with a total cost of 36,000. Perfect. So if I had to plot it, 180 would be the intercept there. That would be my line, would have a negative slope. This question is not asking us to plot, so we just leave this as our final answer. Okay. Assume that the farmer is currently utilizing technology C. The wage rate now increases from 80 Rand to 120 Rand per hour. Just getting my picture that I had earlier. So what we're saying is that currently the farmer is choosing this technology over here. But now the wage rate increases. How does this wage increase affect the relative price of labor? Okay, so this 0.4 here, what does this currently represent? So this 0.4 here currently represents the price of labor over the price of fertilizer. So this is our current relative price of labor. So our relative price of labor is currently 0.4. And I can confirm that by saying that the price of labor, which is 80, divided by the price of fertilizer, which is 200, gives me 0.4. The relative price of labor now is going to be 120 divided by 200, which is now 0.6. So what has happened to the relative price of labor? The relative price of labor has increased. Okay, and that makes sense because if the money price of something goes up, that thing will become relatively more expensive. Okay, so the relative price of labor has increased. Everybody happy with that answer? So wage increase increases the relative price of labor. D then tells us to determine which technology the farmer will employ after the wage rate. Okay, so how are we going to determine which technology the farmer will use? We're going to have to work out the total cost of producing. Now, here's a hint. Do I need to calculate the total cost of technology B? Yes or no? No, I don't. It is dominated. Calculating the total cost of B would be a waste of time because B will always cost more than A. So the only two technologies I have to calculate is technology A and technology C. So how much is technology A going to cost? So technology A uses 2 fertilizer and 5 labor. In other words, the total cost is going to be 2 times 200 Rand. So 2 fertilizer plus 5 times 120. So A is going to cost 400 plus 600, which is 1,000 Rand. C has a total cost of, so it's 1 fertilizer and 7 labor. So it's going to be 1 times 200 plus 7 times 120. And that gives me 200 plus 840, which is 1040. Everyone agree with my answers there? So A is costing 1,000. Did I make a mistake? 2 times 200 is 400, plus 600 is 1,000. 1 times 200, 200 plus 700, 140. Yeah, I get 1040. Just want to confirm that everyone gets the same answers as me, because sometimes I can make mistakes. Thanks, Xander. Great. Okay, so which technology is the farmer going to use after the wage increase? It's going to use technology A. So to get the full marks for this question, you have to show this calculation, and then state the farmer will now use technology A. 1, 2, 3 marks. Okay. Question E then asks, what is the innovation rent associated with adopting this technology? Okay, so let's remember what economic rent is. Economic rent tells us the difference between the value of some new decision less the value of the reservation option or the status quo. So in the case of the farmer, currently they're using C. So C is the status quo. Now they're going to choose to use A. So the innovation rent is going to be the difference in what is earned through using technology A and what is earned using technology C. Recall that the total revenue will be the same whether they use A or B, because A or C, because both A and C are going to produce 10 crates, and those 10 crates would be sold for some price. And so the difference in the value, the profit being made using technology A and technology C is going to be the innovation rent. And so the innovation rent is going to be 40 Rand. So what the innovation rent tells us is that moving from the status quo, the current option, which is now costing 1040, to this new innovative technology, or this new technology, which is now costing less, which only costs 1,000, the farmer is saving 40 Rand. So their cost is 40 Rand less, which means they're making extra rent of 40 Rand. Does that make sense? So we compare the cost to the current technology to the cost of the new technology, and the difference in that cost represents the additional rent that they can make. It's the cost saving when you adopt that technology. Okay, great. So another question. I really want to make sure that this section of Unit 2 is going to be like banked marks in A3. So I'm going through quite a few questions from this unit. So we have a firm making use of labor and capital to produce its output. Suppose that the wage rate is 10 Rand and the price of a unit of capital is 20 Rand. A firm has the option to choose between 3 technologies, and you get shown those technologies here. This is equivalent to me showing it to you in a table. What I'm saying is that Tech A, Tech B, Tech C. So Tech A, labor and capital. So Tech A uses 50 labor and 2 capital. Tech B uses 20 labor and 12 capital. And Tech C uses 5 labor and 16 capital. Okay, now let me ask, are there any dominated technologies there? So are any of technology A, B, or C dominated? Might take a little bit of time to think through it. Can anyone see a dominated technology? Okay, so someone thinks B might be dominated. Someone says there are no dominated technologies. So I'm going to agree with Ms. Matris. I would say that there are no, no, it's fine, Mr. Sneeman. Okay, so I'm going to say there are no dominated technologies. And the reason why is because technology A, yes, it uses more labor than tech B, but it uses less capital. Technology B uses more labor than technology C, but it uses less capital. So none of these technologies are dominated. In other words, all of them are potential options. We would regard all of them as options for the firm. We then would have to figure out which is going to be used depending on the cost. Okay, so if capital is plotted on the vertical axis, derive the equation of the isocost line that corresponds to a total cost of 100. Okay, so this is basically the same thing we've been doing, I think, 2 or 3 times now. So we have 100 is equal to 10 times labor plus 20 times capital. And we rearrange so that K, capital, is on its own on the left-hand side. So 20K is equal to 100 minus 10L. And so K is equal to 5 minus a half L. Okay, so there's our answer. If you gave this as your answer, you would get half a mark. Giving this as your answer gets you the full 1 mark. Where does the 10 and 20 come from? So remember, total cost is equal to the price of one input times the amount of that input that is used, plus the price of the other input times the amount of that input used. So the price of labor is the wage rate, which is 10 rands, and the price of capital is 20 rand. Okay, so the 10 and 20 come from the prices. Do we need to say K? Yes, it's good to use K because theoretically speaking, in economics, we always use K to represent capital and we always use L to represent labor. If you use a letter like Y, technically it's not correct because Y and X are simply abstract terms used in pure mathematics. In using this theory, we're being very specific that we're talking about labor and capital. So please use K and L. It's a great question. Okay, B then asks us to write down the slope of our isocost line from A, which is minus a half. What does the magnitude or absolute value of the slope represent? So this minus a half in absolute terms is a half. And what does that half represent? Anyone want to say? So a half represents the something of labor. The relative price of labor. Great. Okay, so a half represents the relative price of labor. Every time I choose to employ 1 unit of labor, I'm having to give up half a unit of capital. C then asks which of the technologies A, B, or C will the firm choose to use to produce their output? Show your calculations. So what are we going to have to do here? We've already established there are no dominated technologies, so we have to calculate the cost of all 3. So A is going to cost us, so A uses 50L and 2K, so it's going to be 50 times 10 rand plus 2 times 20 rand. It's going to put an R in front of there. So it's going to be 500 plus 400, which is 900. B is going to cost us 20 times 10 rand plus 12 times 20 rand. And so that's 200 plus 240, which is 440. And then C is going to cost us 5 times 10 rand plus 16 times 20 rand, which is 50 plus 320 is 370. Okay, so if someone can just double check my math, but my calculations tell me that the firm will choose. Total cost for A is wrong. So 50 times 10 is 500. Oh, you're right, 540. Told you I do make mistakes. Thank you so much. Doesn't change the answer. C is the cheapest technology. Thanks for picking that up. The question was, would it be wrong if we write minus a half instead of the half? So Ms. Brewer, technically minus a half would be wrong. And the reason why is because when we talk about a relative price, the relative price is a measure of the opportunity cost of something. A cost is negative. So the negative is implied. So the reason why we talk about the relative price as a half and not minus a half, because we know that half represents a cost. It's the same as why we never put MRS as a negative. So we'll cover that tomorrow. Okay, so the firm will choose Tech C. Okay. Now, question 9, this is where it becomes a little bit trickier. So this is a past paper question MCQ that I'd like to go through because it does look at this from a slightly harder angle. So the question says, the graph shows the 5 different available technologies for producing 1,000 liters of soft drink per day. QL measures the number of workers, QK measures the number of bottling machines. In addition, 2 Isocost curves reflecting the current price of bottling machines and the wage rate are shown. In other words, if we look at these 2 lines, they're parallel, right? And the reason why they're parallel is because both of these Isocost lines have the same slope, and the slope is the relative price of labor. So you can imagine an Isocost line also going through A. It's going to have the same slope, and an Isocost line through D, and an Isocost line through E. So we can actually draw a multitude of Isocost lines with the same slope. Those different Isocost lines just represent different total costs. So if I look at this picture here, which technology is currently the cheapest given the current relative price of labor and capital? So which technology A, B, C, D, and E is currently the cheapest? And then I'd also want you to tell me why. Okay, so how would we figure out which of these technologies is the cheapest without knowing anything about the price of labor and the price of this capital, the bottling machines? We would see which of these technologies lies on the lowest Isocost line. Okay, so think about it this way. This value here represents the amount of labor that would be used for this total cost. That labor is less than this labor here. Okay, so a lower Isocost line represents a cheaper total cost. So B is currently the cheapest. Okay, now Jasmine, I'm going to, so I'm basically going to change your statement to B because it has a lower total cost. All of these technologies face identical relative prices, because remember the slopes of these Isocost lines are the relative price of labor. So when I produce B, I face the same relative price as I do at A, as I do at D and C and E. Okay, so B is the cheapest because it has a lower total cost. Okay. Then Ms. Brewer says the dominated ones will be removed. Okay, so if we look at this picture here, which technologies are dominated? So which technologies out of A, B, C, E, and D are dominated? So Michle says C and E are dominated. Yes. Awesome. So C is dominated by B, and E is dominated by B, and E is dominated by D. Okay, so C and E are dominated. Great. So C and E are dominated. This is all good theory that we're going through. Okay, so let's go to the statements. We need to figure out which of these statements are true. Statement 1 says D is the cheapest available technology. Is statement 1 correct or incorrect? True or false? D is the cheapest available technology. False. We've already said that. B is the cheapest technology. 2 says a firm would make more profits using technology A than using technology E. So would the firm make more profit using A than using E? True or false? So let's think about these isocost lines. The isocost line going through A would look like this. So A lies, okay, I agree with you, Ms. Brewer. That's why I left this to a bit later. So if we had to draw an isocost line going through A, it would look like this. So A lies on a isocost line that is lower than E. So if A lies on a lower isocost line than E does, that means A costs less, so it would make more profit. So 2 is a true statement. Yes, so A is cheaper because it would lie on a lower isocost line. 3 then says, if a single firm had a patent rights on technology B. So what that means is that only that firm can use technology B. That firm would earn an innovation rent. So if B was the only firm that could use technology B, would it make innovation rent? True or false? So Ms. Machabe says true, Mr. Melinda says true. Yes, it is true. And it's true because B is currently the cheapest. So whoever is using technology B has the lowest cost of production. So this is true. Okay. Then statement 4 says technology D could never become the cheapest available technology, even if the relative prices of the inputs do change. So is it true that D could never be the cheapest? False. Okay, so how could we see that? Now imagine if labor becomes really, really cheap. So the slope of these isocost lines is the price of labor over the price of capital. If labor becomes very, very cheap, in other words, the price of labor goes down, what happens to the overall slope? The slope gets smaller, so these isocost lines will become flatter. Now imagine these isocost lines become really, really flat, so that they now take this shape. D could fall on a lower isocost line than B. So D could be the cheapest technology if the price of labor is really, really, really low. So this is an incorrect statement. That is a false statement. Okay, so 1 is incorrect, 4 is incorrect, 2 and 3 are correct. So A says only 2, that's not right. B says 4 and 1, that is not right. C says 2 and 3, that is correct. And D got printed on the next page, and D said only 4. And that is incorrect. So the answer is C. Okay, now I'm going to throw a curveball at you. And I'm going to say, what if statement 4 said, technology E could never become the cheapest available technology, even if the relative prices of the inputs do change. So if statement 4 had said technology E, would that have been a true or false statement? It would have been a true statement because E is dominated. So it doesn't matter what the relative prices of the inputs are, E could never become the cheapest because it's dominated. Awesome. Great. Okay, last one on this unit, in this section of the work. And this is, in my mind, in my view, one of the hardest questions I've seen on this theory, which is why I've left it to last, so that you feel all prepared to tackle it. So in the graph below, K is the amount of capital required in production and L the amount of labor. A and B represent different technologies for producing 100 cucumbers. B is currently the cheapest technology. However, A could become the cheapest technology if. So what this means is that if B is currently cheaper, then the isocost lines that go through A and B currently look something like this. Okay, I haven't drawn this too well, but imagine these are parallel. So B currently lies on a lower isocost line. But A could become cheaper if the isocost lines look like this. Okay, so what this tells us is that A could become cheaper if the price of capital over the price of labor increases. Okay, now why have I written this as price of capital over the price of labor? So up until now, the slopes of these isocost lines have been the price of labor over the price of capital, but now it's the price of capital over the price of labor. Why has it changed? Can anyone identify why the slope is now the relative price of capital and not the relative price of labor? I'll give it a little bit of time because maybe someone is typing out an answer. So the slopes of these isocost lines in this picture are representing the relative price of capital, whereas in our previous pictures, the slope was the relative price of labor. Look at these two pictures next to each other. What is different? Capital, labor, labor, capital. Yes, because the axis is inverted. Okay, so the slope of our isocost lines are the relative price of the input on the x-axis. Okay, so whatever input is on the x-axis, that's the relative price that determines the slope. Okay, so what we've established is that the slope of these lines is given by the price of capital over the price of labor. For A to become cheaper than B, this value, PK over PL, must increase. Okay? So Ms. Nkube says, so the slope is Y over X. So the slope of the isocost line is the change in L over the change in K. So change in Y over change in X, rise over run, which is the same as the price of K over the price of L. Okay. So the slope of our isocost line is always going to be rise over run, change in L over change in K. And this is equivalent to the price of K over the price of L. So the price of the thing on the x-axis divided by the price of the thing on the y-axis. Okay. Okay, so for this slope to get steeper, so to move from being flat where B is cheaper to being steeper where A is not cheaper, this has to increase. Now, there are several things that could happen for this to get bigger. If the price of capital goes up, then this whole ratio, this whole fraction will go up. If the price of labor gets smaller, this will also get bigger. Okay, so capital can become more expensive, relatively speaking, if either the price of capital goes up or if the price of labor go down. Okay, so those two things can have the same effect. So if we go to A says A could become cheaper if the price of capital and labor both decrease by the same percentage. So if we look at this formula here for the slope, PK over PL, if these two numbers both decreased by 10%, what would happen to the overall value? So if both the thing in the top, so if both the numerator and the denominator decreased by the same percentage, so if this changed by 10%, this changed by 10%, what would happen to the overall value? So Mr. Selleck thinks it would decrease. Anyone else have a different answer? Stay the same, remain the same. Okay, so I'm going to put numbers to it because this will help to convince you. So let's say the price of capital was 20 and the price of labor was 10. If they both decreased by 10%, then the top would be 18 Rand, the bottom would be 9 Rand. 20 divided by 10 Rand gives me the same answer as 18 over 9. So if both changed by the same percentage, nothing would happen. It would remain the same. Okay? So I think where you might be getting confused is by this last bit of the statement, which says by the same percentage. Okay? So if these two values both decrease by 10%, then the overall value will stay the same. That is different to saying both decrease. So let's say both of them decreased by 1 Rand. So they're not decreasing by the same percent, they're just both decreasing. If this decreased by 1 Rand, it would be 19. If this decreased by 1 Rand, it would be 9. 19 divided by 9 would give me a value that is different from 20 divided by 10. So because they're changing by the same percentage, that value doesn't change. It remains the same. So A would not result in PK over PL getting bigger. It would effectively do nothing. B then says the price of capital and labor both increase, but with a greater percentage increase for the price of labor. In other words, these both increase, but this percentage increase is larger than that percentage increase. What would happen to this overall value if the numerator increases by a smaller percent than the denominator increases? Okay, so again, we can just put numbers to it in order to prove it. So let's say it starts off being 20 Rand and 10 Rands. And now the numerator increases by 10%, but the denominator, I'm going to say, increases with a greater percent. So it's going to increase by 20%. What happens to the overall value? The numerator becomes 22 Rand. The denominator becomes 12 Rand. 22 divided by 12 Rands, that is smaller than 20 divided by 10. So B is not correct. B will not increase PK over PL. It will actually decrease PK over PL. And then it would make B even cheaper. Question C says, the price of capital and labor both decrease with a greater percentage decrease for the price of capital. Okay, so both of these are decreasing, but the decrease in the numerator is a larger percentage than the decrease of the denominator. So if this is falling by a larger percentage than this is falling, what happens to the overall value? It will also decrease. So C is incorrect. And then we check that D is correct. The price of capital increases while the price of labor remains constant. So if this price goes up, but this price doesn't change, what happens to the overall value? It increases. So the answer to D, to this question, is D. If capital becomes more expensive and the price of labor doesn't change, then the price of capital over the price of labor goes up. If that goes up, the isocost lines become steeper, and that could make A cheaper than B. Okay. Like I said, this is the toughest question I've seen from this section of work. So the answer is D. Okay, so Ukraine's GDP in 2021 was $200 billion. In 2022, it is estimated that Ukraine's GDP had declined by 35% due to the ongoing war. Ukraine's population was estimated at 41.4 million in 2021, but it is believed that approximately 8 million people have left Ukraine between 2021 and 2022. Which one of the statements below is false? Okay. So in these options, we're looking for how has the population decreased? How has GDP per capita decreased? Is the percentage decrease in population different from the percentage decrease in GDP? What is the GDP per capita? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to calculate the percentage change in the population, and I'm going to calculate the GDP per capita in the 2 years, and then the GDP per capita change. And that will help us to get to the correct answer once we do all those calculations. Okay. So what we have is the populations, I'm going to say 2021 and 2022. The population in 2021 was 41.4 million. In 2022, the population shrunk by 8 million. So in 2022, it would be 33.4 million. I simply took 41.4 and I subtracted 8, and that gives me 33.4. That means that the percentage change in the population is going to be the population in 2022 minus the population in 2021 divided by the population in 2021. And then we multiply that by 100 to take it into percent. So I would have 33.4 minus 41.4, and I would divide that by 41.4, and I get and then multiply that by 100, so I get minus 19.32%. So A says the population decreased by approximately 19.3. The negative tells me it's a decrease. So A is true, which makes it incorrect for this question because we're looking for a false answer. B then says GDP per capita increased by approximately 19.4. So what I want to calculate is my GDP per capita. So my GDP in 2021 was 200 billion. My GDP in 2022 was 35% higher, sorry, lower. It declined by 35% compared to 2021. In other words, my GDP in 2022 is going to be 200 billion times 0.65. So what I'm saying is that the GDP in 2022 is 35% less than the GDP in 2021. So I'm multiplying it by a factor of 0.65. Because if I take 35% away from 1, I'm going to get 0.65. So my GDP in 2022 is $130 billion. So that tells me that my GDP per capita in 2021 is 200 billion divided by 41.4 million. Okay. Now, the important thing here to know is that 1 billion, so 1 billion is 1,000 million. So that means I'm going to take 200,000 million divided by 41.4 million. So I'm just going to convert this billion into millions. So what I would have is 200,000 million divided by 41.4 million. And that gives me 4,830.92. So my GDP per capita in 2021 is this. In 2022, it's going to be 130 billion divided by 33.4 million. So again, I'm going to multiply this by 1,000 to take it from billions to millions. So I have 130,000 divided by 33.4 gives me 3892.22. So if we go back to the answers, D says the GDP per capita in 2022 is approximately 3892. That is correct. So D is true. C says the percentage decrease in the population, which we already calculated, is minus 19.32. So this is minus 19.32%, is smaller than the percentage decrease in the GDP. The percentage decrease in the GDP is 35%. So the population is declining by 19.3, whereas the GDP is declining by 35. So this statement for C is true. So the only option we're left with is B, which says that the GDP per capita increased by approximately 19.4%. So I can figure out whether or not that is, in fact, the right answer for this question by using my two values here and calculating the percentage change in GDP per capita. And that's going to be the new GDP, which is 3892.22. And I'm going to subtract my old GDP of 4830.92. And I'm going to divide by my original GDP of 4830.92. And if I put that into the calculator, I get, divided by 4830.92, I get minus 19.4. Actually, I didn't even need to go and calculate it. Can anyone see why B is false without me even having to calculate it? Because what I've calculated is that, yes, it did decrease by minus 19.4%, but what about the statement for B makes B false? So why is B false? Read carefully, because it says increased, but it decreased. Awesome. So that increased makes B false, which is why it is the correct answer for this question. Okay, this is a very involved calculation. The calculation in question 22 is much simpler. So we get given the GDP per capita of Greece in 2021 and the GDP per capita of Greece in 2022. Now they want the growth rates of GDP between 2021 and 2022. To be absolutely correct, this should say GDP per capita. So to calculate the GDP per capita growth, so the GDP growth, which is simply the same as saying the percentage change, it's going to be the GDP per capita in 2022 less the GDP per capita in 2021. And we divide by the GDP per capita in 2021. And if I put that into the calculator, I get minus, and then I multiply by 100 to take it to percent. So minus minus 2.35%.